There is a particular kind of laughter that happens in rooms full of wealthy people. Sharp, confident, and always, without exception, at someone else's expense. That laughter filled a ballroom in downtown Chicago on a Friday evening in November. 300 guests in tailored suits and diamond earrings. Champagne flutes catching the light from a chandelier the size of a small car. And in the middle of that laughter stood a man in a plain gray suit. Quiet, unbothered, holding a glass of water he had not touched. He said nothing while they mocked him. He simply watched. And 3 days later, every single person in that room would receive an email that made their stomachs drop, because the man they had humiliated in front of their entire industry was the same man who now owned the roof over their heads. Stay with me until the end of this one, because what he did next is the part nobody in that ballroom saw coming, and it's the reason this channel exists. If stories like this one speak to something in you, hit subscribe right now before we go any further, so you never miss the next one. If you're watching from New York, Chicago, Atlanta, London, or anywhere else in the world, welcome. I'm glad you're here. This is Noble Stories. Type in the comments where you're watching from. I read every single one. Now let's begin. Daniel Hayes was 51 years old, and if you passed him on the street, you would not look twice. He was not a flashy man. He drove a 10-year-old Ford truck with a dent in the rear bumper he had never bothered to fix. He wore the same 3 gray suits on rotation, bought off the rack from a department store in Ohio, and he still cut his own hair with clippers in his bathroom mirror, the way his father had taught him 30 years earlier. He lived alone in a modest 4-bedroom house outside Columbus, a house far smaller than his net worth would ever suggest, because Daniel had built his fortune the slow way, one shipping company, one logistics contract, one careful, patient decision at a time, over almost 3 decades. By the time he turned 50, Daniel controlled a private holding company worth just over $4 billion, though almost no one outside a small circle of bankers and lawyers knew his name. He preferred it that way. He had watched, over the years, what money did to men who wore it loudly, how it changed the way people looked at them, how it invited a particular kind of attention he had never wanted. So he stayed quiet. He let his company speak, and he stayed, deliberately, almost invisible. There was a story Daniel liked to tell, rarely, and only to people he trusted, about the first company he had ever bought. A failing trucking outfit in rural Indiana, back when he was 32 years old with almost nothing to his name but a small loan and a stubborn belief that most struggling businesses failed not because of bad luck, but because the people running them had stopped listening to the people working for them. He had walked the loading docks of that trucking company for a full week before making a single decision, talking to drivers, to mechanics, to the woman who answered phones at the front desk, long before he ever sat down with the executives who ran it. That habit, watching before acting, listening before deciding, had never left him. It had simply gotten quieter as his fortune grew larger. That November, Daniel's holding company was in the final stages of acquiring Whitfield Textiles, a mid-sized manufacturing firm based in Chicago that had been struggling for 2 years under mounting debt and outdated equipment. The deal had been negotiated almost entirely through intermediaries, lawyers, financial advisors, a small negotiating team, because Daniel preferred it that way. He liked to observe a company from the outside before he ever stepped into it directly. He liked to see how people behaved when they didn't know they were being watched. So when Whitfield Textiles CEO, a sharp-tongued, image-conscious man named Richard Ashford, sent out invitations for the company's annual Founders Gala, a lavish black tie event held every November to celebrate Whitfield's legacy and court investors, Daniel's advisors quietly arranged for him to attend, not as the billionaire acquiring your company, not with fanfare, not with a formal introduction, simply as a guest, listed on the check-in sheet under a name that meant nothing to anyone in that room. Daniel Hayes, Hayes Logistics Group. His advisors had warned him it might not go smoothly. Richard Ashford was known, in certain circles, for a particular kind of arrogance, the type that measured a man's worth by the cut of his suit and the size of his watch. One of Daniel's senior lawyers, a cautious man named Peter Cole, had gently suggested that Daniel might want to attend with a formal title, or at the very least a driver, someone to signal that he wasn't simply a nobody wandering in off the street. Daniel had declined, almost amused by the suggestion. If a company can't treat an ordinary man with basic respect, he told Peter over the phone that week, then I need to know that before I sign anything, not after. He wanted to see, with his own eyes, exactly what kind of culture he was about to inherit. He had no idea, walking through those doors that evening, just how thoroughly he was about to find out. The Whitfield Founders Gala was held in the grand ballroom of a downtown Chicago hotel, the kind of room with marble floors and gold-trimmed columns, where every surface seemed designed specifically to remind guests of the wealth surrounding them. 300 guests moved through the space in tailored tuxedos and floor-length gowns. A live string quartet playing near the entrance, waiters weaving through the crowd with trays of champagne balanced on white-gloved hands. Daniel arrived at exactly 7:15, wearing his plain gray suit, the same one he wore to board meetings, to funerals, to grocery stores. He had considered, briefly, borrowing something more appropriate for the occasion. He decided against it. If Whitfield Textiles culture could not tolerate an ordinary man in an ordinary suit, he reasoned, that told him something important about the company he was buying. He was right. Told him everything. Within the first 10 minutes, Daniel felt the room's attention slide past him the way water slides around a stone. Not with hostility exactly, but with a kind of practiced dismissal, the look people give to someone they've already decided doesn't matter. A waiter offered him champagne and, when Daniel politely declined and asked for water instead, gave him a small, almost imperceptible look of confusion, as though water itself were an insult to the room. A coat check attendant, taking his plain wool overcoat, glanced twice at the tag inside the collar. A department store label, not a designer name, before hanging it quietly among furs and cashmere. He made his way toward the edge of the ballroom, near a long table displaying the company's history, old photographs, framed awards, a small plaque commemorating Whitfield's founding 50 years earlier. He stood there quietly, reading about the company's original founder, a man named Walter Whitfield who had started the business in 1974 with a single sewing machine in a garage, a detail Daniel found himself lingering on, given how far the company's current leadership seemed to have drifted from that same modest beginning. Richard Ashford approached with 3 other executives in tow, mid-conversation, laughing at something one of them had said. Richard Ashford was 53, tall, silver-haired, dressed in a tuxedo that had clearly been tailored that week. He had built his reputation on charisma and confidence, the kind of man who commanded a room simply by entering it, and who had, over many years, come to genuinely believe that his success was purely the product of his own brilliance rather than the company his father had handed him nearly 20 years earlier. He glanced at Daniel, just once, briefly, the way you might glance at a piece of furniture, and said, to his companions rather than to Daniel directly, "I don't think I recognize this gentleman. Are we letting the catering staff mingle now?" The 3 executives around him laughed. One of them, a younger woman named Claire Whitmore, the head of investor relations, added, not unkindly but not kindly either, "Maybe he's lost. This event requires an invitation, sir." Daniel said nothing at first. He simply looked at Richard for a long moment, calm and unreadable, the way a man looks at something he is quietly reevaluating. "I have an invitation," he said finally, his voice even unhurried. "I was told this was an open evening to meet the people building this company's future." Richard's smile did not falter, but something sharpened behind his eyes, the particular irritation of a man unused to being questioned. "And what exactly do you do, if you don't mind my asking?" "Logistics," Daniel said simply. "I work in shipping." Richard turned to his companions with a small, theatrical laugh, the kind designed to be overheard by everyone nearby. "Shipping," he repeated, as though the word itself were amusing. "Well, I hope the open bar doesn't come out of your paycheck too badly tonight, friend. Enjoy yourself, but perhaps stay near the appetizers. Some of tonight's guests represent 9-figure investment portfolios, and we wouldn't want anyone getting the wrong impression about the room." The group around him laughed again, louder this time, and several nearby guests turned to see what the joke was, catching only the tail end of it, enough to smile along, enough to glance at Daniel with the same dismissive amusement, without ever knowing why they were laughing at all. A woman nearby, dressed in emerald green, leaned toward her companion and murmured something behind a gloved hand, glancing at Daniel's shoes. Plain, sturdy, unremarkable, with a small curl of her lip. Daniel did not defend himself. He did not raise his voice, did not correct them, did not offer any of the information that might have instantly silenced the room. He simply nodded once, quietly, and said, "Enjoy your evening," before turning and walking toward a quieter corner near the windows, where he stood alone for the rest of the night, watching and remembering every single name. There is a particular kind of clarity that comes to a man standing alone at the edge of a room that has decided he doesn't matter. Nobody performs for someone they've dismissed. Nobody softens their behavior around a person they believe holds no power over them. And so, for the remaining 2 hours of the gala, Daniel Hayes watched Whitfield Textiles reveal itself completely, without ever knowing it was being watched at all. He watched Richard Ashford move through the crowd like a man auditioning for a role he had already convinced himself he'd won, praising major investors effusively, laughing loudly at jokes that weren't particularly funny, refilling his own champagne glass twice within a single hour, while barely acknowledging Whitfield's own factory floor managers, several of whom stood near the back of the room in rented suits, clearly uncomfortable, clearly uninvited into the real conversations happening. Around them, one older manager, a heavy-set man with tired eyes, stood near a pillar for nearly 20 minutes without a single person approaching him. He watched Claire Whitmore, the investor relations head, give a polished, confident speech about Whitfield's commitment to its people. A speech delivered with practiced warmth, complete with a slideshow of smiling factory workers projected behind her, images that struck Daniel as carefully curated rather than representative. The speech rang hollow to him because he had read the internal reports. He knew, from confidential documents prepared during due diligence, that Whitfield had quietly laid off 40 factory workers 8 months earlier while simultaneously approving a substantial bonus for senior leadership, a detail conspicuously absent from tonight's celebratory tone, and one that made the smiling faces on the screen behind her feel less like a tribute and more like a performance. He watched a young factory supervisor named Marcus Webb standing near the drink table, visibly out of place in an ill-fitting rented tuxedo, nursing a single glass of water much like Daniel's own, clearly there out of some sense of obligation rather than genuine welcome. Marcus checked his watch twice within 10 minutes, the small, restless motion of a man counting down the time until he could reasonably leave. Daniel made a quiet mental note of his face, and he watched closely the particular ease with which Richard Ashford spoke about numbers he did not fully understand, inflating certain achievements, glossing over the company's mounting debt, describing Whitfield's financial position with a confidence that did not match the reports Daniel had spent the past 6 weeks studying line by line. At one point, Richard told a small circle of investors that Whitfield's revenue had grown steadily over the past 2 years, a claim Daniel knew, from the documents in front of him just that morning, to be the exact opposite of true. None of this surprised him exactly. Daniel had acquired enough struggling companies over the years to recognize the pattern immediately. A leadership team more invested in appearances than in substance, more comfortable performing success than building it. What surprised him, if anything, was how openly, how carelessly, this particular culture displayed itself. As though the people in that room had never once considered that appearances could be deceiving in both directions, that the quiet man in the corner in the plain gray suit might be reading the room just as carefully as they believed they were performing for it. Near the end of the evening, as the crowd began to thin, Daniel found himself briefly near Marcus Webb, the young supervisor, who offered him an awkward, genuine smile, the only one he'd received all night. "Rough crowd, huh?" Marcus said quietly, glancing toward where Richard Ashford stood surrounded by admirers. "Ashford's all right when the cameras are on. Different story on the factory floor, if you ask the guys who've been there 15 years. Daniel studied him for a moment. "What's it like down there? Honestly?" Marcus hesitated, glancing around briefly before answering. perhaps assuming this quiet stranger in the plain gray suit had nothing to lose by hearing the truth, and nothing to gain by repeating it. He spoke about outdated machinery that hadn't been replaced in over a decade, some of it dating back to the 1990s, machines that broke down weekly and slowed entire production lines. He spoke about safety concerns raised repeatedly to management and consistently dismissed, about a ventilation system in the dye room that hadn't been inspected in years. He spoke about the 40 coworkers let go the previous spring, friends of his, some of them men and women who had worked there for over a decade, while executive bonuses were quietly approved the same quarter. He spoke, in short, about exactly the gap between performance and substance that Daniel had spent 6 weeks reading about in spreadsheets, except now it had a face, a name, and a tired, honest voice behind it. "Sorry," Marcus said eventually, catching himself, offering a small, embarrassed laugh. "You didn't come here for all that. I'm just tired, I think. Tonight makes it worse somehow, watching everybody smile about a company that doesn't smile back at the people actually running it." Daniel thanked him, shook his hand, and left the gala shortly after, driving back to his hotel in silence, turning over everything he'd seen and heard. He did not feel angry exactly. He felt something closer to certainty, the quiet, settled certainty of a man who now knew, with complete confidence, exactly what needed to change, and exactly which people, sight unseen at the start of the evening, deserved a closer look. 3 days after the gala, on a Monday morning at 9 o'clock sharp, every employee and executive at Whitfield Textiles received a company-wide email from the corporate address of Hayes Logistics Group, formally announcing the completed acquisition of Whitfield Textiles by Hayes Holdings, effective immediately. The email was brief, professional, and utterly unremarkable in tone, except for one detail that made Richard Ashford's stomach drop the instant he reached the signature line. "Sincerely, Daniel Hayes, founder and chief executive, Hayes Holdings." Attached to the email was a single photograph, a standard corporate headshot used in Hayes Holdings official materials, required for the acquisition's public filing. It showed a man in his early 50s, plain gray suit, calm expression, unmistakably the same man Richard Ashford had mocked in front of 200 guests 3 nights earlier. Claire Whitmore, reading the email at her desk, felt the blood leave her face. She scrolled back through her own recollection of that evening, replaying with mounting horror the exact words she had used. "This event requires an invitation, sir." Spoken to a man who, it turned out, now legally owned the building she was sitting in, the desk beneath her hands, the very salary that paid her mortgage. Word spread through the office within the hour, the way it always does in moments like this, not through any official announcement, but through the particular electricity of shared, dawning realization. The man in the gray suit, the shipping comment, the joke about staying near the appetizers. Every person who had laughed that night now sat with the same sinking understanding. They had not simply embarrassed a stranger. They had, without knowing it, insulted the very man whose signature would now appear on their paychecks. Someone in accounting, unable to help herself, printed the headshot and pinned it quietly to a corkboard near the break room, where small clusters of employees stopped throughout the day, staring at it in disbelief. Richard Ashford requested an emergency meeting with Hayes Holdings representatives that same afternoon, hoping, perhaps, to smooth things over before any formal introduction took place. He spent much of that day rehearsing what he might say, drafting and deleting several emails, calling his assistant twice to ask, almost frantically, whether anyone had heard back from Hayes Holdings' office. The meeting was granted, not with Daniel's legal team, as Richard had expected, but with Daniel himself, who walked into Whitfield's executive conference room precisely on time, wearing, as it happened, the exact same gray suit. The room fell into an immediate, uncomfortable silence. Richard rose halfway from his chair, extending a hand that trembled slightly, already rehearsing an apology he hadn't quite finished composing. "Mr. Hayes, I want to say, if there was any miscommunication at the gala." "There wasn't a miscommunication," Daniel said, calm and even, taking his seat at the head of the table without hesitation. a small gesture that made his authority in that room immediately, unmistakably clear. You knew exactly what you were saying. You simply didn't know who you were saying it to. That's a very different problem, Richard, and it's the one I actually came here to solve. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. The stillness in that room said more than volume ever could. Over the following weeks, Daniel Hayes did not fire Richard Ashford in a dramatic public spectacle, though many at Whitfield privately expected exactly that, and some, remembering the gala, quietly hoped for it. Instead, Daniel did something that unsettled Richard far more than any public humiliation could have. He simply began asking questions Richard could not comfortably answer. He asked about the 40 employees laid off the previous spring, and why executive bonuses had been approved the same quarter. He asked about the outdated machinery Marcus Webb had described, and why safety concerns raised by factory staff had gone unaddressed for years. He asked, calmly and directly, in front of the full leadership team, whether Whitfield's culture reflected the values Richard had described so confidently at the gala, or whether that description had simply been a performance for the benefit of investors who would never set foot on the factory floor. Richard had no good answers because there weren't any. Within 6 weeks, he resigned, framing it publicly as a personal decision to pursue new opportunities. A phrase Daniel neither confirmed nor denied, because he had learned, long ago, that some men need a dignified exit more than they deserve one, and granting it costs nothing. Claire Whitmore, unlike Richard, chose a different path. She requested a meeting with Daniel directly, and rather than offering excuses, she offered something far more valuable. An honest account of everything she had witnessed during her time at Whitfield, including practices she had gone along with despite private discomfort, and a candid admission that the comment she'd made at the gala had bothered her for days afterward, long before she knew who Daniel really was. Daniel listened carefully, without interrupting, and in the months that followed, promoted her to lead a newly created division focused on workforce conditions and factory floor communication. A decision that surprised many, though not Daniel, who had long believed that a person's honesty after a mistake often mattered more than the mistake itself. And Marcus Webb, the young supervisor who had spoken honestly to a stranger in a gray suit without knowing who he was speaking to, was promoted to plant operations director within the year, tasked with modernizing the very machinery he had once quietly complained about to a man he assumed had no power to change anything. The dye room ventilation system was replaced within his first 3 months in the role. Daniel visited the Chicago factory floor personally on his first official day as Whitfield's new owner, dressed, as always, in his plain gray suit. He shook hands with workers by name, names he had learned, in some cases, from that single evening at the gala, filed away quietly while everyone around him assumed he was simply standing in the corner, ignored and irrelevant. He walked the length of the factory floor slowly, asking questions, listening more than he spoke, exactly as he had done 3 months earlier in a ballroom that had mistaken his silence for insignificance. He stopped near an older sewing machine, asked the woman operating it how long she'd worked there, and listened without checking his watch once as she answered. There is a temptation, in stories like this one, to imagine the ending as simple revenge, the powerful man returning to humiliate those who once humiliated him, a satisfying reversal where the room that laughed now has to beg forgiveness. That is not quite what happened, and perhaps that is the more important lesson buried inside this story. Daniel Hayes did not walk back into Whitfield Textiles to punish anyone. He walked back in to see clearly what he had already suspected from the very beginning, that the way people treat a stranger who appears to hold no power over them reveals something far more honest than the way they behave in front of someone they're trying to impress. A gray suit told him more about Whitfield's culture in one evening than any financial report could have told him in 6 weeks. Perhaps the real question this story leaves behind isn't about Richard Ashford, or the 200 guests who laughed that night, or even about Daniel himself. Perhaps it's a quieter question, one worth sitting with long after the story ends. If the next person you dismissed without a second glance turned out to hold your entire future in their hands, would the way you treated them still feel like something you could stand behind? If the story moved you, let me know in the comments, and don't forget to tell me where you're watching from. This has been Noble Stories. Hit the subscribe button so you never miss the next one.